Good evening and a very warm welcome to everyone for this very special session with the Vice President of the World Bank, Indermit Gill, and the Dean of the Kautilya School of Public Policy and India's former representative to the UN, Syed Akbaruddin. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Today's session is all about discussing careers in multinational, multilateral organizations. And why in education and public policy is key to these. So I also want to sort of say at this point of time to everybody here today that please, your questions are very welcome. Ask as many as you want, and I will try and take as many as I can during this 1 hour. But let me just sorry. Did everyone miss all of it, or was it just the last bit?
Just the last bit, Manika. Okay. Just the last bit. Yeah.
So I'm so sorry, but I just wanted to say that I wanted to start with a very obvious question, which was, what is a multilateral organization? And Mr. Akbaruddin, if you could take that, and why is it very different from others?
Thank you, Manika, and good evening to all of you. Multilateral organizations are by definition those organizations which have multiple states as members. So that's why the term multilateral, different from bilateral, which means only 2 states, trilateral, which means say 3 states, plurilateral, which means more than 3 states. Multilateral by definition would mean a broad array of states. Generally, they would also mean organizations which are open to everybody. That means if you try and fulfill the requirements that are put in place, then all states could join in as members. So that's what multilateral organizations are. Again, by definition, they are very different from other forms of engagement because they represent an array of states, so they're inclusive in nature. They are pluralistic in nature. They will be open to new members. They're not a closed club. So that's possibly the difference between multilateral organizations and other forms of international organization.
Right. Mr. Gill, speak to us about why, especially in the current scenario, in the current sort of, world situation, why would it be more exciting for young people to work for a multilateral organization, let's say, compared to some other organization?
It's a good question. And so I've been thinking about exactly that. The first, I guess the main reason is that if you're curious about what has been happening in the rest of the world, so for example, if you're curious about the fact that back in 1981, you had about 4.5 billion people in the world, and about 60% of them lived on less than $2 a day, right? And we're talking about today's prices, $2 a day, 60%. So more than, 3 billion people essentially lived, right? If you look at things now, you have 7.5 billion people in the world, and less than 6% of them live on less than $2 a day. So if you're interested in knowing why this happened, you should be working, you should try to get into an organization that is international in nature, that is multilateral in nature, because these are things that happen all around the world and there are lessons to be learned from all of this stuff. The other thing is, if you're unhappy with the amount of progress that has been made by India or by Africa or by other places, you should be thinking about working in these multilateral organizations, because they're still very important in creating the kind of conditions in which poor countries can prosper, right? We can talk more about it, but those are the things. These are still very important organizations, and they deal with very, very important subjects. And if you're interested in knowing what's happening in the rest of the world, how you can bring those lessons back to India, how you can take some lessons from India to some of these other places, these are really good instruments for that.
Right. Again, in a world where we're more connected than ever before, right? It's like a global neighborhood. Yet, in so many ways, we're isolated, we're polarized. Are these multilateral organizations key to perhaps progress and sort of a collective progress? And this is a question to both of you. Please take it, Mr. Akbaruddin and then Mr. Gill.
So you're right, Manika, that today's world, the complexity of challenges that face any country is such that they are transboundary in nature, in the sense that they don't stop at the borders or the land borders or the sea borders or even the space of a defined geographical space. So, for example, let's take climate change. Now, if climate change impacts, say, South Asia, it would not stop at the boundaries of India or go down to West Bengal and stop there because Bangladesh is a sovereign entity. Those changes will go across boundaries. So they're transboundary in nature. Now, transboundary challenges are, let's take the present COVID-19 crisis. Transboundary challenges mean that you have to address them in a cooperative and collaborative manner, because otherwise, if you leave somebody behind, things come back to trouble you. Let's take again the issue of the current health situation. Those who think that they can isolate themselves from a certain part of the world because they have been able to address the challenges within their boundaries are going to find it difficult down the line, because you've seen that the virus is mutating. You may be able to control one variety, but today's global connected world, it will come back in other forms. So multilateral organizations provide you the basis of that collaboration and cooperation. That said, we need to also acknowledge that despite these sort of challenges being transboundary in nature, being multidisciplinary, broad-based in nature, the world still is based on nation states. And it's a very difficult task for people to understand that you have to go beyond that. And that's where our broader understanding of the world will come in. If you think that, no, my country will address a challenge by itself, you may address it at a certain stage, you may address it in a certain phase, but on a longer time perspective, you will face problems. So multilateralism provides that platform, that cushion, that opportunity to collaborate and cooperate. The world isn't there as yet, but it shouldn't be that we stop trying to do that.
Mr. Gill?
So I actually forgot your question, Manika, but
that's all right. I can absolutely repeat myself. I was asking that, you know, in the current world scenario, are these multilateral organizations really key to progress in a collective global manner?
Yes. So actually, Dean Akbar is absolutely right, because I think that it's very difficult for countries to progress on their own. It's impossible for them to do that because these influences are all global. And so, for example, go back to what I was saying. You saw sort of, 3 or 4 decades of immense prosperity between 1990 and 2010. So you start to think about it, and you find that 3 or 4 things contributed to that. The first one was, of course, that you had peace and domestic stability in more and more parts of the world, right? And if you think about it, you would actually attribute at least some of those achievements to multilateral efforts from UN agencies and others, right? The second thing is that you find that basically what has happened is that the world has become more stable, or during that time, the world became more macroeconomically stable. Inflation rates dropped and so on. And you would attribute at least some of those achievements to organizations like the IMF, right? Then the third part was that the share of the world started to trade a lot. There was a huge recovery in trade. Trade's a very important thing because poor countries tend to have the supply. They tend to be able to create the conditions for increasing the supply of things, but they take longer to actually create the conditions in which these things also demanded. So international trade was very important, and organizations like the WTO helped to create this broader framework in which poorer countries could trade with richer countries and take advantage of their markets, their know-how, and so on. And then finally, the fourth thing that was very important was a good climate for private investment. And I think that organizations like the World Bank have to get some credit, at least, in trying to sort of exchange lessons about how one can create this, right? So for all those reasons now, you start to think about the problems ahead. You think about climate change, you think about inequality, you think about aging and things like that. You'll actually find that many of the solutions to these things tend to be multilateral in their nature.
Right. I actually, coming from, you spoke about the WTO, Dean Akbar spoke about climate change, but in so many ways, there are so many conflicts around the world. I mean, take COVID, for example, and the entire battle over vaccination and, who's going to get the vaccine first, are the poor countries going to get it, South America is still suffering. Really, with practically every country looking after its own interests, and that's fine as well. I suppose, people have to look after their own first. How does it work? I mean, where is that meeting point, and how do these multilateral organizations then decide that somewhere everyone benefits? Mr. Akbar?
So let's take the present crisis as a case study. Let's look at vaccines. Now, vaccines are quintessentially a form of international cooperation. If you look at the number of ingredients that go into a vaccine, you will find that by and large, one country is not self-sufficient in that. By and large, there will of course be exceptions at a certain stage, etc. Because there are some ingredients from one part of the world, there are other ingredients from the other part of the world, and they are finally got together in a third part of the world. And the need perhaps is in a fourth part of the world. Now, if you then say that, no, my country only, then there will be issues of problems because at a certain stage, you will go well. But when you run short of an ingredient, what do you do then? Because the vaccine will not be complete without ingredients from a broad array of countries. So for that, you will have to have some form of international cooperation, whether it is multilateral, plurilateral, etc. and all. Now, in addition, threats which are transboundary in nature also require that you address them even if they don't threaten you immediately. Let's look at a threat which we have faced, for example, terrorism. I remember when I was a young diplomat in the late 80s and early 90s, when we would say terrorism is a threat, people from many countries would say, oh, this is a policing problem. This is your issue. This is not our issue. For many years, many African countries also felt that terrorism was something to do with, say, the Middle East. It didn't bother Africa. But today, Boko Haram, for example, is a bigger threat than many other conventional terrorist organizations. So to address these, unless you bring people on a common platform, by definition, that common platform will be a lowest common denominator. And I acknowledge that because as you raise the bar higher, people will then go their different ways. But at least a lowest common denominator is where you start. And then you build up. For example, on the vaccine issue, there is a global effort called the COVAX initiative, where countries are pledging, those who are better off are pledging finances as well as vaccines for the others who would not otherwise have access to it because vaccines are not produced everywhere. So there is an initiative which is based in Geneva through the Gavi Foundation, where they are trying to invest and say about $30 billion to try and address the needs of the more vulnerable parts of the world. As you said, Latin America. Africa now is increasingly being threatened by the virus. So, this will take time because while people pledge, everybody is finding it difficult to put the money forth. Also, the capacity is not there, and everybody wants their populations to be addressed first, which again is understandable, especially when there are force measures like we faced in India. That said, at least the intention is there, the pursuit is being followed. It would take time, but then there is no other choice. So if I can summarize and say, multilateralism will not lead the world to a heaven, but it will try and prevent you from falling into hell.
Right, interesting words, but some would argue that heaven in multilateral organizations largely rests with the richer countries, with the more powerful countries, as they have a bigger say and a bigger hand in the pot. So, Mr. Gill, what happens then? Is this really, about everyone coming to the table, or is it okay? Whatever I can get out of it. How does it work in that sense?
So I think that you have asked the most important question of all, Manika. It's a superb question, and I think that it's very relevant for the people who are listening in today. So why is it that people from India ought to be going into multilateral organizations? It goes to the crux of the problem that you just said, that because of the fact that the countries that have been richer, where about 1 billion people live, right? They tended to have more money, they tended to have more know-how, they tended to have more of the economic production in the world. That is where the markets were. And so they had a lot of power, right? They still have a lot of power, especially in these multilateral organizations, because these multilateral organizations tend to change slowly, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because you don't want to sort of adjust too quickly to a thing. But because of that, you actually do find that the voice of developing countries in these organizations should not be something that you take for granted, okay? You should not take that for granted. So for example, I'll give you an example of this. This morning, I saw that they just released a report that was commissioned by the president of France, and two very prominent economists actually led a big team to look at the economic challenges that the world is facing, right? And they said that there were 3 challenges, and those challenges were, one was climate change, one was an aging population, an older population, and the third one was income inequality, right? Now, this was a report done for France by a bunch of people. I think all of them pretty much were from developed countries, right? If you look, so, as soon as you see this report, you find, places like the World Bank and IMF and WTO and so on, they all start to say, oh, these are the big problems that the world faces. No, these are the big problems that France faces, okay? France has less than 1% of the world's population, okay? So maybe France should worry about these things. So if you automatically think that these 3 are the big problems that the world is facing, then don't bother coming to a multilateral organization, because there are enough people who already do that, okay? On the other hand, if you want to sort of say, no, hold it. Let me see, are these the top 3 things that, is this something else? Which aspects of these? Because when you look at that report, you find there are certain aspects of these problems, because these are big problems, right? There are certain aspects of these problems that report particularly emphasizes. Are those the aspects that you should care about? Should you care about global warming, or should you care about local pollution? Those 2 are related, but they're not the same thing, So if you believe these reports, and the people, there are lots of people here at the World Bank and the IMF and so on, who would take these reports as gospel and say, okay, if this is a problem for France, this is a problem for Chad as well, okay? Not true, okay? So if you want, so I think that it's really important for people who are concerned about the problem of the world, including those of India, because India is a big part of the world, then, and if you want to question some of these things, to get to the problem, exactly the problem that you mentioned, Manika, which is that these organizations tend to be still dominated by countries that may not be a big part of the world in terms of GDP, but they tend to be a big part of the world in terms of where people are wealthy, people are very knowledgeable about things and so on, and they're very good at trying to get these multilateral organizations to do the sort of things that are in their own interests. Okay.
Right.
I'm saying things that are controversial, but I think I'm saying things that are true, and I bet Dean Akbar will agree with me.
Right. So we've got questions coming in, but before I go to them, one would ask that, so are these multilateral organizations really relevant? Would it not be better if, regions smaller groups, smaller packs? I mean, there is also a lot of talk about the UN really, what does it do? Is it really effective? So is that the way to go, or, are smaller groups better?
So, Manika, before I answer that, I just wanted to add to the Mr. Indermit Gill's response to the last question. Now, this question of that the strong do what they can, they do, and the weak submit to whatever they can. This is not a new the discussion in global philosophy. If you go back to the history of the Peloponnesian War during the Greek times, it's the same issue. But let's just look for a minute at after the UN was formed. It's true that there are countries who have a disproportionate role to play in the agenda. But let's look back and see, has the agenda also been influenced by the not so strong? So when you look at the UN in 1945, there were 51 countries who were part of the UN. So by definition, it was largely the victors of World War II and a few others there. So apartheid should not have been on the agenda of the UN because it was not in the interest of those who were there. Similarly, decolonization. There were 85 countries today who are members of the UN who were colonies when it started. And this whole wave of decolonization, which started around 40s with the independence of India, took off on the basis of discussions in the UN repeatedly that everybody has a right to be free, etc., decolonization. So entire decolonization agenda was there. Now look at the climate change agenda. Frankly, it was not the big countries who brought this to the table because the big don't need. Actually, many people say multilateralism is the playfield of Gulliver and the others because they want to tie up Gulliver. The smaller ones would want to tie up Gulliver to keep him to the narrow and straight. So climate change was an initiative of small island developing states because they feared that they are going to be drowned, they are going to be overwhelmed, etc. And it took 20 years, but it's now come mainstream. When it was started around the turn of the century, most people, including India, felt this is not an issue for us. We didn't create the problem. We should not be part of it, etc. This has to be addressed by somebody else, and we are not going to get into it. So there are clear advantages for small states to be part of large organizations. Now I come back to your question about smaller organizations. There is no competition between smaller regional groups and multilateral agencies, multilateral organizations, because every issue need not be addressed by everyone. If you can resolve it at your regional level, sub-regional level, as Africa has, they have West African Association, they have Southern African Association, etc., etc. You can address them if you have the platforms, and the multilateral organizations actually promote them. Even on finance, you have the Asian Development Bank, they have the African Development Bank, and then you also have the World Bank and the IMF. So I don't see this being antithetical. They are actually complementary, where small is beautiful and it can be the body to address, we should use them. Where larger platforms enable smaller states to engage across boundaries, across regions, and push agenda that would otherwise not be possible, then that also is a opportunity.
Right. How interesting to compare multilateral organizations or even the UN to Gulliver's Travels. I think it's just a fascinating visual as well. But I'm going to go to my first question now. And this is Ayush Shukla, who's asking, is there any preferable educational backgrounds for jobs in multilateral organizations? I'm an engineering student. What would be my roadmap for my UN journey? Either one of you.
I can start this one. Okay, so I was trying to sort of think about this, and I guess I would think that answers to this, Manika, tend to be influenced by your own experience, right? So keeping that caveat in mind, so what should you do to get a good job at a multilateral organization? I think the first one I would say is master a technical skill. It could be anything. It could be in engineering. It could be in public finance, as I worked. It could be how to run a political campaign. It could be climate action. It could be any of this, but just try to sort of try to acquire a skill in an area that you're passionate about, but within that area, try to acquire skills where the demand is reasonable and the supply is short, okay? Because if you sort of go into something where everybody wants to go into, you're going to have a tough time getting a job. That's just the laws of demand and supply, and they apply to multilateral organizations as well as to anybody else. The second thing I think would be learn a language, okay? It could be Spanish, Russian, Chinese, French. It could be any of the official languages of the UN, of the World Bank, or whatever. If your English is good, if your English is not good, improve your English first, okay? Then learn a language. The third thing is, I would say, improve your communications. You have to write well, you have to speak persuasively. We all need to work on these things. Sometimes you need to write, you could be writing very well, but not quickly enough. You could be speaking persuasively when it's a prepared talk or when it's one-on-one, but you may not be able to speak persuasively in large meetings. Work on the things that we have to work on. And then the last thing I think is get a graduate degree, okay? Because it turns out that most of these organizations have a lot of people who apply for them. And so they apply certain filters, and one of them is a simple one, a graduate degree from. But while you are acquiring a graduate degree, don't just see it as a signal. I think that the people who are the most effective form relationships with their professors. They form relationships that really hold them. So for example, when I was doing my master's at the Delhi School of Economics, I formed really good relationships, and they actually led to jobs first at the World Bank and then to other places. But it was not that deliberate for me. But if I had to do it all over again, it would be deliberate. So I think that, and sometimes what this means is that you have to do things that your professors are interested in, not that you're interested in. Work for them for free too sometimes. I know this is a self-serving recommendation on part of both Dean Akbar and me, but I tell you it works. It works because you form relationships and you get to know things that you wouldn't otherwise because you spend time with your professor. So the four things: master a technical skill, learn a language, improve your communications, get a graduate degree, and get it at a place. Don't get it at a lazy place like Harvard or Yale. Get it at Kautilya, where we try harder because we are new. We are trying to prove a point, and you will form relationships with people at Kautilya.
Absolutely. And like you said, the whole bit about demand and supply, get a master's degree in public policy because there is a lot of demand and there isn't enough supply. But Dean Akbar, just to sort of link what Mr. Gill said, how would we at Kautilya prepare students to have a career in a multilateral organization?
If I just use the same analogies that Mr. Gill used, but coming from it from a different way, I would say that multilateral organizations require three fundamental elements. Number one is domain knowledge. So whatever domain you want to pursue, it's fine. Domain knowledge of engineering, just as the questioner asked, or medicine, or law, or whatever. That's a given for any career that you want to pursue, whether in multilateral or other organization. So that's the base on which you build. And number two would be skill sets. So what are the skill sets that multilateral organizations would want? And one they would want is the highest standards of professionalism, efficiency, and competence. So you start building into your work ethic these elements as you evolve as a student, as a master's student. And if you come to Kautilya, be certain you will be drilled with these skill sets. Let me add to what Mr. Gill said again, communication skills. Now, why are communication skills important? Multilateral organizations, by their very nature, are very diverse. They have people from very diverse backgrounds. So it's important to communicate both in written format as well as orally in a manner that others can understand you and comprehend. That's a entirely different skill from writing for yourself or writing for a small group, because the breadth and the pluralistic nature of those organizations demand you to be careful in your approach, understanding of diversity, be inclusive, and we could give many other examples of that. So that's a second. And a third one would, a skill set, a subset of skill sets would be linguistic abilities. All international organizations would prefer people who have knowledge of more than one of their official languages. And that is, in our case, English, but I would urge students who want a longer term career to look at other possible languages that they can at least understand or comprehend, because given the competition, it's a tripwire. If you know two, then you jump over that hurdle and go. Now and the third one is where Kautilya actually plays the biggest role, and that is a value system. International organizations look for candidates who can adjust to the value systems that they promote. And what are those value systems? They are integrity, probity, impartiality, inclusiveness, honesty, diversity, concern for the neglected and vulnerable sections, a balanced outlook, and a commitment to continuous improvement. All these are values that we at Kautilya will insist on every student being imbued with in the 2 years that they spend with us. They may go out with different domain knowledges, but their value system is what we will focus on. And that's what will mark them out as different compared to others who will be in the so-called rat race for better opportunities in a multilateral system or in the world in general. These are values which are not only for a livelihood, but they are for a lifetime. And that's what we promise to give at Kautilya.
Right. Mr. Gill, Radha asks, how do you see the role of multilateral organizations in the future when there are questions being raised about why the WHO didn't alert the world against COVID-19 in time. Similarly, the performance of the WTO or the UN Security Council, the entire issue of climate change, you know, a lot of times reaching to no results because developed countries walked out. So is there a future for multilateral organizations?
Okay, so I'll try to answer that question. But before that, I just thought I would add just one thing to what both I said and what Dean Akbar said. You know, I think that he said it very, very well. The way that I would summarize what we said was, look to create a T-shaped profile for yourself, a T profile. A T profile means essentially having domain knowledge, having a good idea of what the big problems in international, you know, the big development challenges are, both for your country as well as for the rest of the world. So have that and get an understanding of what people are doing. So that's the domain knowledge part of it. And then the other part of it, which is the vertical part of this, is to have a skill set that distinguishes you from others who may also have that domain knowledge. So, you know, he spoke about the skill sets, about work habits, values, and things like that, right? I think that to try to answer the question that you said, you know, ultimately, in all of these organizations, what really matters are people, okay? Now, if you go to these organizations with weak values, with the wrong values, with no respect for candor and so on, right? You will find that you will add to the complexities that these organizations already have. On the other hand, if you go with, you know, a clear sense that, look, you're going to be working for the greater good of people, especially people who cannot look after their own, and that you're going to speak clearly, you're going to speak politely, clearly, but you're going to speak up when it really matters. You will find that mistakes like the one that the WHO made will not happen as much, okay? So it really, again, it depends on people. So those are, you know, we hope that at Kautilya, you go to these organizations through Kautilya, and there'll be fewer mistakes like the ones that were made at the WHO, okay? You can go through other places too, but you know, you have to sort of realize that these organizations, after all, do depend on the values of people.
Right, and that is just so important to have the right values wherever you work. I mean, it's not just about multilateral organizations. Dean Akbar, there is a question from Sahil Khare, and he says, is it possible for us, while working in the corporate sectors, can we pursue this degree at Kautilya?
My understanding is that this is a full-time course. Nothing comes free in life. You have to invest as you sow, so you reap. There are, of course, options of executive education for corporate people who are already working to plug into a certain short-term skill set that they would like to gain from. These, by definition, will be small courses spread over 2 days, 3 days, a week at most. And that is a possibility for people who are working. But people, if you have to inculcate mindsets, values, skill sets, domain expertise all together, it would be difficult to combine it with a day job. Kautilya and the master's program is a day job. Invest in it. I can guarantee you that it will be an investment for a lifetime. So I wouldn't want to suggest that you can do this in parallel with doing another day job. But you can certainly look for, there are alternate methods for gaining some skill sets that Kautilya will offer for people who are already working. But if your question, if I misunderstood the question, and if your question is, can I come to Kautilya through a corporate job? The answer is yes. There are many others who already joined here, who have come from corporate backgrounds, because public good is not the monopoly of either the state or the non-governmental sector. Public good also includes good corporate citizenry. And certainly corporates play a very important role, and we would welcome them to play that role, and your coming in would only add to it. Thank you.
Right, and like Dean Akbar said, I also just wanted to add that we at Kautilya are starting executive education courses from late August. The schedule for those will be out, and if you're continuing to work but want to get a certain skill set, you can definitely look at those. Mr. Gill, there is a question from Manika, and she says that does working in the NGO sector as a lawyer help in building a career to work in a multilateral organization?
So actually, I was struck by a question that Samiksha asked. She asked a question. She said that that since this is the first batch of people doing the studies at Kautilya, how can we be assured that we are going to get jobs? Right? I thought it was a very good thing. So I would like to sort of say three things to Samiksha. The first one is, because we are new, we are going to be trying harder. Okay, so you'll see that we think that people come to places like Kautilya for a master's in public policy, not just to get knowledge, but also to get a job, or to get a better job. And we know that. And so if you sort of get the most out of Kautilya, you will certainly have an inside track on the kind of jobs that you want, right? I think folks at Kautilya will do their best to open the doors. They'll do their best to open doors for you, right? If you've learned a lot at Kautilya, if you made the right connections with people, when those doors are open for you, you will be able to walk through them, right? The third thing, though, is because just as we have founding deans and founding directors and founding faculty, we're going to have founding fellows. So the thing that you will instantly do as soon as you join Kautilya is you'll start to create institutions like the kind that we're trying to create, and you'll be part of that venture. So even the journey is going to be very, very rewarding for you. And you'll always be part of Kautilya, right? And so you can always come back to Kautilya to get more information, to get better contacts, etc. Okay? So that's the reason why I think that we are special. So, yes, you're the first batch, but because you're the first batch, you're a special batch, you'll be treated specially. And I think that you will actually help us build a better organization. Now, I was too busy trying to sort of answer her question. And I again didn't hear your question, Manika.
That's all right. You answered a question. No, I was asking that, and I'm sorry, I forget the name, but the question was that if you're working as a lawyer in the NGO sector, does that help your career in sort of, then getting a job or making a career in a multilateral organization?
So I guess, take a look at these multilateral organizations. There tend to be many of them, right? They tend to do many things, and they tend to be fairly inclusive in terms of the kinds of specialties they require, the kinds of things that they do. So absolutely. So if you're a lawyer working on an NGO, I think you actually have an inside track. Okay.
Fantastic. Dean Akbar, there are lots of questions, and I'm sort of just going to combine them because they're all of the same strain. There are a lot of students here, or many young men and women, who are preparing for their civil services exams. And they want to know, is this master's degree something they should look at, or, just continue to pursue prep for their civil services exams? What would you suggest? What do you think is the future for them?
So, policy making is a complex outcome of inputs from various segments of society. The civil services is one important stream which contributes to policy making. If any of those of our students want to go that stream, yes, they can. Even as they pursue masters in Kautilya, they will be inculcated with the spirit of policy making and what goes for policy making. So in their career, I wish I had a career which enabled me to connect the dots in such a multidisciplinary way, because I was, for example, an arts graduate, a bachelor in arts and a master in international relations. But by the time I went to the UN the second time as ambassador, I found that science and technology was such a key element of negotiations at the UN. I was not a graduate, or I had no exposure to science and technology. But over the years, I had learned to keep abreast of new things. So what education in Kautilya will do for you is to enable you to connect those dots of a transdisciplinary nature, which will come in handy for decision making at a later stage. Now, if your question is, will this enable me to pass the prelims? My answer is, I don't know. But if you tell me that, will this enable me to be a successful policymaker? My answer would be yes, 100%, because it imbues you with that spirit of policy making, that understanding of policy making, which will be key to decision making as you enter a career through any medium, whether through a state agency, whether as an advocacy group, or as a corporate influencer of public policy. All these things require careful monitoring, balanced approach, effective communication, understanding transdisciplinary issues, and decision making, which will balance these out. That's what you will get from a master's 2 years spending with us, will give you those skill sets, which will be effective for you in your careers everywhere. It's not only in the state sector, but everywhere. And as I said, I wish if there was a master's in public policy 35 years ago, I would have opted for it.
Great. So now this is a very interesting one, and I'm going to start with you, Mr. Gill, and then Dean Akbar as well. Rishabh is asking, why is that multilateral diplomat jobs pay so less? For those interested in jobs in global governance, let's say sort of, climate-induced transnational migration, you want to work in the UNEP or the UNDP, why do young individuals have to give up earnings and jobs, because they want to contribute? Is it that less?
Okay. So I was actually, I actually did see this question. I guess I saw it in the chat group. And I think that if you want to sort of work on, I guess if you want to work on issues related to international development and so on, they will not pay the most. I mean, you can go to places like, large multinationals and so on, and they'll pay a lot more. But they pay enough. They pay enough, especially because you can end up, say that you're based in a place like Washington, or you're in a place like New York and so on. You actually get the best of both worlds, because you end up having a first world living standard, but yet you can work in developing countries. So while you spend a lot of time in these countries, your family, can actually enjoy fairly high standards of living. I'm not saying that you get paid a lot, but I think that you get an immense amount of satisfaction from your work, because you're trying to actually, but you have to be passionate about it. So you have to trade off passion and pay, right? But it's not inadequate. I don't think it's inadequate. Now, here's the other thing. I think that pay, including in multinational organizations, depends on supply and demand. So if you have a skill that a lot of people have, you might get a job at a multilateral organization, but they're as smart as anybody else. They know they can get you for a fairly low salary, because what you get outside of those organizations is fairly low, right? So I think that you should actually, focus on the skill. So if you have a skill which is relatively rare, you will get compensated for it, whether it's in a multilateral organization or not. In a multilateral organization, you'll have the additional satisfaction of working on things that you're passionate about. So you have to be passionate about it. There was one other question, Manika. So I saw a question that said that, why is it that, what exactly are multilateral organizations doing in the area of climate change? And why is it that India is not adopting cleaner sources of energy and so on? Now, this is a complicated question, so I'll give a short answer. But I think one of the things that you should do is take a look at the World Bank's website for India, right? And you'll see actually that the India program of the World Bank has a lot of work that it does in these areas. There's a lot of work on urban pollution. There's a lot of work on the misuse of water resources. There's a lot of work on energy efficiency. But if you sort of think about this, you have to sort of keep two things in mind. The first one is climate action, really has these three components. The first component is energy efficiency. I mean, this is something that poorer countries should do, because you get a lot of benefits when you save on, when you stop wasting energy, right? You get the benefit of fiscal savings, because often the waste comes because the government is subsidizing the use of these fuels and so on. You also get the benefit on the health side because they're less polluting and so on, right? The second thing is cleaner energy sources, right? Now, this is something that India is doing. This is something that China is doing a lot more of and so on. And this is something that you find that countries, when they start to reach levels of per capita income around $4,000 or $5,000, they start, you actually get a demand for cleaner energy sources and so on. And that demand has to be met by governments. And they tend to start to do that. So I think some part of that, you will see that, 10 years back and so on, you would probably have less demand for these things in India than you do now. And 10 years from now, if India has grown well and doubled its per capita income, for example, you'll find a lot of demand. And because India is a democracy, because it's a representative democracy, these demands will have to be satisfied to some degree or another. And multilateral organizations can help in that effort. But for large countries like India, multilateral efforts cannot easily influence government policy. They can support government policies, okay? So that demand has to come from Indians, right? And the third important part of this is natural resource management. How to look after your water resources, your forests and so on. And in that too, India can do many, many more things much better, right? And these things are related, of course, because if you give fuel subsidies, you end up basically subsidizing the price of water that you drill from the ground, and then you end up really distorting the choices of farmers and things like that. So India actually can do many things, not just in the area of clean energy, but also in the area of much better management of natural resources as well as energy efficiency. Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Mr. Gill, for that. It's 6:54, and I'm afraid we'll have to start wrapping up. So last questions. There is a question, Dean Akbar, about what are the career prospects for someone with an MPP degree in India? We're talking about multilateral organizations, but what about India? What are the career prospects here?
So I think that's a very good question, because multilateral organizations will always be a niche opportunity. They are important, they are global in nature, but they are niche opportunities. There is a vast expanse of opportunities opening up in India. And what are they? Let's look at three areas again. One I've addressed is the state sector. So if you would like to do civil services after you do your course, you can. It doesn't contradict your being a MPP graduate. In fact, it adds value to it, number one. Number two is the entire opening up of the corporate sector and the complex regulatory options that are coming up. Increasingly, corporates would want to have people with understanding of public policy, domain knowledge of complex new issues that are now, whether it's artificial intelligence and privacy, whether it is digital information and regulation, whether it is environment and opening up of citizens advocacy groups. So there is a whole expanse of corporate interest in regulation. Another area of corporate interest is the whole notion of corporate social responsibility. As corporates are required to display in a very visible manner their social responsibility, they will need people with expertise to advise them on where to invest or where not to go about. Increasingly, for example, coal. Coal is now becoming a touch-me-not for a huge segment of finance corporations. So they will require advice on whether they would need to assist in alternate energy, what are the implications of these, what are the rules, etc. So this entire area of corporate social responsibility is opening up, and corporate jobs too will open up. A third area is the notion of advocacy groups. And advocacy groups will increasingly play an important role, both in influencing the complex nature of government decision-making, but also implementing several government decisions, because governments realize that they are not able to do everything that they provide for. So they will act in concert with what we call CSOs, civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, etc. So there are these three broad bands, and each of them is expanding. You are only 60 guys. So there is no issue at all for 60 guys to find opportunities in this vast country of ours, where multiplicity of opportunities are opening up for those who understand public policy much better.
Thanks so much for that. And I'm sorry, we're completely out of time. We have to wrap this up now. Thank you so much, Mr. Gill and Dean Akbar, and thank you everyone for coming in today. I saw some of you who had your videos on that you were taking notes, so I hope this was helpful. It was wonderful. I learned a lot of things. And let's hope we can do many more discussions, and we hope to see you again. Thank you all so much.